okay, well, my grandmother started teaching me little songs when I was 3. And I started my first lesson when I was 5. There was a classical organist named Joyce Jones. So after I learned the names of the notes on the piano, she said, okay, stand over there. What's this note? I said, C. What's that one? F sharp, A flat. And then over time, she'd be hitting, and I'd name every one of those notes, right? So that was like, I mean, even though I'm reading notes, I'm also learning by listening. So I played in church some, but then I also started accompanying the chorus in high school, junior high school, and then I continued that on into high school. So I mean, I was classically trained, but there were some guys that I got in with. One of them was a guy named Kirby Stewart, and Kirby was a brilliant bassist. That he was also one of these tinkerers about stuff. I mean, we were all 14, 15, 16 years old. So he got a popular mechanics and electronics book, and he found this thing. It was called Sweet 16. So it was like 16 speakers. They're all like 4-inch speakers or something like that. And he had 2 of them in his bedroom. I mean, those things were huge, right? But he was a great bass player, and all he wanted to do was play with Woody Herman. But somehow I had met him, and he and this drummer and a sax player were exploring Dave Brubeck. And back then, there weren't any books that had, and I didn't know what chord changes were anyway, so I transcribed everything, voicings, and all all that stuff. So I learned everything about it, and that was my introduction to jazz. And when I wanted to go up to North Texas and I wanted to study jazz, they said, "You don't have any experience." I said, "Well, I've transcribed Oscar Peterson solos, Bill Evans, Thelonious Monk. I know all this stuff, but I just don't know the names of the chords. I don't know what a ninth or a +9 or any of that stuff is." That's why I wanted to study. They said, "Well, you can't do that." Okay, well, we're going to put you in the classical thing. So I started, into the classical program in North Texas. And I said, listen, when I got together with the guys, of course, he started me on Mozart. Mozart I played when I was 7, 8 years old. So I said, listen, I've been playing Chopin. There's one piece that I wanted to learn of Chopin, a scherzo in B flat minor. It goes. There's all this kind of stuff. The guy said, well, you can't study that until at least your junior year in college. So I went out and bought the music. Third or fourth lesson, I said, listen, I'm having a little trouble with a piece. Can you help me with it? Yeah. So I played about 5 pages by memory. And he said, okay, we'll study that. But in the meantime, I still didn't get any jazz learning. I was still transcribing everything, writing down notes. I knew what the notes were, the chords. I just didn't know what to call them.
So you were saying you were interested in jazz by Dave Brubeck in high school, and you didn't really get into it much in North Texas. So how did that happen? You were really steeped in the classical stuff. How did you get to that?
What happened? I mean, it's like, I was steeped in classical, but my dad, he was a musician, but he didn't play. He was a trumpet player back when he was in the teens. So he had a great record collection, 78 records, and he had everything from Mills Brothers to Louis Armstrong to Mahalia Jackson to Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Nat Cole, and so I grew up, and Spike Jones. so I grew up listening to that, influenced by it. And of course, my brain is going, oh, this is cool, and I learned when I was 12 years old, my parents took me over to the Elks Club because they joined that. And when you're a Southern Baptist, you're not supposed to drink or smoke or dance, right? That's the deal. So they go over there on Saturday nights and drink and smoke and dance. But there was a guy that had a Benny Goodman style trio, and what that was, there was a guy that played clarinet who lived like a block away, and a drummer that had played with Glenn Miller's band, Cody Santaford. And then the piano player was Swain Cummings. So I'm 12 years old and watching them, and they knew I played, but Swain taught me how to play stride piano, which, you know, because they didn't have a bass player, so it's all this. You know, all that kind of stuff. So I'm learning that. And of course, there's no books that'll teach you how to do that.
Right.
But the other thing about Fort Worth, which is very interesting, was the wide variety of music they had there. Bob Wills lived there for a while, so he had Western swing. You also had Ray McKinley, who led the Glenn Miller Band. You had Tex Beneke hung out there. But you had, you know, Freddie King. You had all kind of blues and all kind of Ornette Coleman, Dewey Redmond grew up in Fort Worth.
I was going to say, and wasn't Illinois Jaquette there too?
No, I think he was down in either Dallas or Houston.
Okay.
But I mean, it was just King Curtis lived there, and Chuck Rainey and all that bunch, you know, which became Aretha Franklin's rhythm section. So, but it was just, you know, nobody from Fort Worth went to Dallas. Dallas was a cosmopolitan, so they didn't really accept us over there. So we just had our own little industry. And
wow,
I remember one of the guys that's from here, or this guy named Steve Bruton, and Stephen's father had a record store in Fort Worth. He was a jazz drummer, and he'd play at night and taught school during the day. But everybody went over to the record store, and he had everything from I don't know, Brubeck and Junior Mance and Gerald Wilson, and you know, all these like really obscure things. He had a great taste in music, so that was the place where a lot of people learned how to play there. And also, when you started becoming a musician, there were a lot of gigs around. So some of them were over at North Side, Fort Worth, which is where the stockyards were, and the gigs were 5 hours. You know, 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off, and what I talked to Bruton about, he was a great guitar player. He played with Chris Christopherson for 20 years. He was one of the guys that, you know, got South by Southwest going here. But in 5 hours, you play everything you know. You know, and it could be blues, could be jazz, could be country. Who knows? You know, you're playing on your instrument, and you have to create because you don't want to play the same thing. And then, you know, you got the drunks coming up and say, "Hey, can you guys play a honky tonk?" Sure. You know. So I kind of hung around Fort Worth a little bit. I had a gig, and then in January, my dad got a call from the union president in Fort Worth that said, "There's a guy named Clyde McCoy that needs a piano player." And his wife and his wife's family were from Fort Worth, so that's why they call Ken Forward. And so here I am, 18 years old, and I went on the road with Clyde. Now the song that he played was Sugar Blues, you know, which is. And it was a wah-wah trumpet. Wah, 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 wah. And what happened, okay, I went on the road with him for about a year. New York, we played New York for 3 weeks. We alternated with the Supremes in Atlantic City.
Wow.
I mean, that was really interesting. They had the full orchestra and everything. But it also got me out of Fort Worth. You know, we toured, we played Florida. I mean, the first gig, me and the trombone player driving down in a Volkswagen on U.S. highways. 24-hour drive. He picked me up in Arlington and we drove down to Florida. You know, but what happened? Clyde was 64 years old, but he was touring with big bands when everybody else was. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and so I mean his knowledge of all the old Dixieland standards, and I mean he was from Kentucky, so I mean he knew Louis Armstrong, knew all these people, so I had a big knowledge of all that stuff, and so that was like a real big foundation that I learned, you know, a lot of those sorts of things from Clyde. And then also at that same time, this is 1967. So rock and roll had already started coming in, you know, the Cream and stuff like that, Jimi Hendrix. Thomas Organ Company invented this pedal for a guitar that would simulate the wah-wah trumpet of Clyde McCoy.
Wow.
So they sent him a pedal, and they said, we need your endorsement on this, thinking that would sell, you know. Well, it did, you know, and so the first pedals that came out, Clyde gave it to his guitar player. The guitar player played guitar and banjo. So it's like, what am I going to do with a wah-wah trumpet? We already got a guy that's doing it. But when the pedal came out, that's when Jimi Hendrix and Clapton, everybody else came in. It was Crybaby Wah-Wah. You know, so all of a sudden the music has changed. And oddly enough, Paul Deemer, yeah, okay. I got to talking with Paul Deemer one night, and it was like the guitar player we had in Clyde's band was a guy named Kurt Warren. And Kurt was from El Paso. So when I met Paul, I said, did you happen to know Kurt Warren? He said, yeah, Kurt was my teacher in University of Texas of El Paso. And it's like 50 years later, you know, I'm playing with a student of a guy that I played with 50 years. I mean, it's just, you know, that's the thing about life. It's just like this huge circle.
You know, you're one of the deans of music. You've been in Austin about 20 years, and I want to hear a lot about that too. So where do you sit now? I know you are effortless when you're going from 9 years old to 59 years old to 7 years old. So where do you sit in terms of linking the generations together? How do you view yourself as not only a musician, but as a wonderful teacher of so many?
Well, for one thing, is like, you know, everything is built on something that came before. You know, I mean, you get back to Bach, you know, even before Bach was influenced by somebody. You know, you go back to Gregorian chants, you know, hey man, check out this new chant, you know, but what Bach did, Bach was an improviser as well. You know, he just made up stuff. And people said, well, what are you playing? He said, well, let me write it down for you, you know, because they didn't have any recorders. So the further advanced you go, the more you can look back on where all this stuff started, you know. Rhythms. I mean, all that stuff started in Africa, you know, and there's nothing new about it. Where I sit is I can listen to somebody new, and maybe somebody comes up and said, what do you think about, you know, Robert Glasper or something like that? Well, okay, if you listen to him, you know, you can kind of trace it back. You go back to Bud Powell. Who? Okay, and then you go back further than that. And everybody influenced everybody else. You know, I mean, one of the best films out is that The History of Jazz that Ken Burns did, because you see how everything, you know, is built on everything else.